The day my neighbor demanded $1,800 because he thought my Wi-Fi was sabotaging his internet. I honestly believed it was some kind of joke. The problem was, he wasn't laughing. He was standing on my front porch with a stack of printed documents in one hand, anger written all over his face, looking at me like I had just committed a felony. And somehow, that bizarre accusation would end with an internet technician standing inside his house, exposing a problem that had been sitting there the entire time. Looking back, the strangest part wasn't that he blamed me. It was how desperately he needed someone else to blame. My name is Nathan Cole, and a few years ago, I moved into a quiet neighborhood just outside Fort Collins, Colorado. It was the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened. Most people kept to themselves, lawns stayed trimmed, kids rode bikes in the evenings, and the biggest community drama usually involved somebody forgetting to bring their trash cans in after pickup day. I liked it that way. I worked remotely as a cybersecurity consultant, so peace and quiet weren't luxuries for me. They were necessities. My house became both my office and my refuge. And after years of dealing with unstable internet in different places, I finally decided to upgrade my entire home network. Nothing crazy, just a modern mesh Wi-Fi system with stronger coverage and better reliability. I spent a Saturday setting everything up, optimizing channels, testing speeds, and making sure every corner of the house had a solid connection. It was the kind of thing I genuinely enjoyed. Most people spend weekends golfing or watching football. I apparently spend mine naming Wi-Fi access points and checking signal strength. At the time, I had no idea that simple upgrade would somehow become the center of a neighborhood conspiracy theory. Across the street lived a man named Carl Hensley. Carl was in his late 50s, retired early from some logistics company, and possessed a very particular talent. Whenever something went wrong, he could identify a culprit within minutes. The only catch was that he was usually wrong. If his sprinkler system malfunctioned, somebody must have tampered with it. If his packages arrived late, delivery drivers were incompetent. If traffic backed up near the highway, city planners were idiots. Every inconvenience had a villain. Every frustration had a target. Personal responsibility rarely made the list. We weren't enemies. We weren't friends either. We existed in that strange suburban middle ground where you wave politely while secretly hoping the conversation stays under 30 seconds. For almost 2 years, that arrangement worked perfectly. Then one evening, about 2 weeks after I installed the new Wi-Fi system, I noticed Carl standing at the edge of his driveway, staring toward my house. Not casually looking, staring. I remember giving him a wave while carrying groceries inside. He didn't wave back. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the delivery box for my new router system sitting near the recycling bin. Something about the look on his face felt odd, but I shrugged it off and went inside. If I had known what was going through his head at that moment, I probably would have laughed. A few days later, on a Tuesday evening, I was halfway through reheating leftovers when someone started pounding on my front door hard enough to shake the glass beside it. Not knocking, pounding. I opened the door and found Carl standing there, red-faced and breathing heavily. In one hand, he held several printed pages covered in charts, timestamps, and technical information. Before I could say a word, he shoved the papers toward me. There, he snapped. Proof. I looked down at the pages. Router logs, signal graphs, diagnostic screenshots. I looked back up. Proof of what? His jaw tightened. You've been interfering with my internet. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard him. What? Ever since you installed that new system, my connection has been dropping every night. I blinked. And you think that's because of my router? I know it's because of your router. The confidence in his voice caught me off guard. There wasn't even a hint of uncertainty. He wasn't investigating a possibility. He had already convicted me. Carl, I said carefully, that's not really how Wi-Fi works. Don't start talking down to me. I'm not talking down to you. Then explain why my internet started failing right after you installed that thing. I could already feel where the conversation was heading. Facts weren't going to matter. Logic wasn't going to matter. He wanted validation, not answers. Still, I tried. I explained overlapping channels, signal congestion, household interference, hardware failures, the countless reasons a network could become unstable. The more I explained, the angrier he became. Finally, he pointed toward my living room window, where one of the network devices sat glowing faintly on a shelf. Every night I see that thing running, my connection drops. It took everything I had not to laugh. Carl, that's like blaming your neighbor's porch light because your television stopped working. His eyes narrowed immediately. Wrong answer. You think this is funny? No, I think you're making assumptions. Assumptions? His voice rose. I've lost work because of this. Then came the number. The number that transformed an awkward conversation into something unforgettable. You owe me $1,800. I stared at him. Excuse me, $1,800. That's how much business I've lost. For several seconds, I honestly wondered if there was a hidden camera somewhere recording my reaction. Nothing about the conversation felt real anymore. Carl, I'm not paying you $1,800 because your internet is acting up. His face hardened. Then maybe I'll let somebody else settle it. The way he said it wasn't a threat exactly. It was worse. It was confidence. The confidence of a man who genuinely believed evidence would support him. He turned around, marched down my driveway, crossed the street, and disappeared inside his house. I stood there for a few moments staring after him, then shook my head and went back inside. The whole thing felt ridiculous. Annoying, sure, but ridiculous. I figured he'd call his internet provider, they'd find the problem, and that would be the end of it. What I didn't know was that Carl had already decided on a different plan, and 48 hours later, a phone call from our internet provider would turn his accusation into an official investigation. What I didn't know was that Carl had already decided on a different plan, and 48 hours later, a phone call from our internet provider would turn his accusation into an official investigation. I was sitting in my home office finishing a client report when my phone rang. At first, I almost ignored it because the number wasn't saved in my contacts, but something told me to answer. A woman introduced herself as a customer service representative from Rocky Mountain Communications, the provider that serviced both my house and Carl's. The moment she mentioned an interference complaint involving my address, I actually laughed. Not because it was funny exactly, but because it felt absurd hearing somebody repeat Carl's theory with a straight face. Unfortunately, the representative wasn't calling to joke around. Carl had apparently submitted a formal complaint claiming that my recently installed network equipment was causing repeated service disruptions to his property. Company policy required them to investigate. They needed access to my home and his home. They needed to run diagnostics. They needed to document everything. By the end of the call, I was no longer amused. Not because I was worried they would find something. I knew they wouldn't. What bothered me was realizing that Carl had actually spent time building a case against me. He hadn't just complained. He had gathered logs, filed reports, called support representatives, and convinced himself that he was some kind of victim in a technological Cold War happening across the street. The technician was scheduled for Friday afternoon. For 2 days, I watched Carl move around his property with the confidence of a man expecting vindication. Every time I stepped outside, I caught him glancing toward my house. Once, while checking my mailbox, I heard him talking to another neighbor named Steve. As soon as he noticed me approaching, the conversation stopped. Steve gave me an awkward nod and quickly walked away. Carl simply smirked. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I've always believed that false accusations carry a different kind of weight. Even when they're ridiculous, a tiny part of you worries about perception. You wonder what people are hearing. You wonder whether they believe it. You wonder if your silence looks like guilt. By Friday afternoon, I was ready for the whole thing to be over. Around 2 o'clock, a white service van pulled into the neighborhood. The technician stepped out carrying a laptop case and several pieces of testing equipment. His name was Marcus Delgado, a guy probably in his early 40s with the calm expression of somebody who had spent years dealing with angry customers and strange complaints. Before he could even reach my front door, Carl emerged from his house and practically intercepted him halfway across the street. I watched through my window as Carl spoke animatedly, pointing toward my property multiple times. Marcus listened politely, nodded occasionally, then eventually headed toward my house. When I opened the door, Marcus offered a friendly handshake. "Afternoon. Nathan, that's me." He glanced back toward Carl and smiled in a way that told me this wasn't the weirdest thing he'd dealt with that week. "Let's take a look." For the next 20 minutes, Marcus inspected every piece of network equipment in my house. He checked signal strength. He checked transmission power. He analyzed channel usage. He reviewed system logs. Meanwhile, Carl hovered nearby, like a prosecutor waiting for a confession. Every few minutes, he would interrupt. See? That's the device right there. Make sure you check that setting. The problem usually starts at night. Marcus remained patient. Painfully patient. Eventually, he finished the first round of diagnostics and looked up from his laptop. Everything here appears normal. Carl frowned immediately. That can't be right. Marcus turned the screen toward him. Signal levels are normal. Power output is normal. No abnormal emissions. No anomalies frequencies. No interference indicators. Carl folded his arms. Check again. I actually had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. Marcus did check again. Same results. Then he closed his laptop and stood up. Let's inspect your equipment. For the first time all afternoon, I saw uncertainty flicker across Carl's face. Just for a second. Then it disappeared. Fine, he said. We walked across the street together. The moment I stepped inside Carl's house, I noticed something strange. His living room looked normal enough, but the corner where his networking equipment sat looked like it had been assembled by somebody who actively disliked technology. The router was shoved behind a massive metal filing cabinet. Not beside it, behind it. Most of the device was completely blocked from open space. Next to it sat an aging microwave that looked like it belonged in a museum. The coaxial cable feeding the modem appeared worn and discolored. Even without technical expertise, it looked unhealthy. Marcus noticed it immediately. He crouched beside the equipment and started examining everything. Carl stood nearby watching confidently, at least at first. Then Marcus unplugged the coax cable and frowned. How long has this been installed? Carl shrugged. Years. Marcus ran a finger along the cable and held it up. Corrosion. Lots of it. This should have been replaced a long time ago. Carl shifted slightly, but that's not causing the nightly outages. Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he connected diagnostic tools and started reviewing historical logs. Minutes passed. The room grew quiet. I watched his eyes move across graphs and timestamps. Then I noticed something interesting. Marcus leaned closer to the screen. He zoomed in. Then he opened another data set. Then another. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Finally, he looked up. What time do you usually eat dinner? Carl blinked. What? Dinner. Around what time? 6:30. What? Marcus looked back at the logs. And when do your connection drops normally happen? Carl thought about it. Usually around 6:30 or 7. Marcus nodded slowly. Interesting. For the first time, Carl's confidence cracked. What does that mean? Marcus stood up and pointed toward the old microwave sitting beside the router. How often do you use this? Every day. For dinner? Yeah. Marcus turned his laptop around. Your connection interruptions match almost perfectly with microwave usage. Carl stared at him. That doesn't make sense. Actually, it makes perfect sense. Marcus explained that older microwaves can leak interference into the 2.4 gigahertz range, especially when aging components begin to deteriorate. Normally, it isn't a major issue, but placing a router directly beside the microwave while also hiding it behind a giant metal cabinet created the perfect environment for signal degradation. Then there was the damaged cable, introducing additional instability. One problem alone might not have caused noticeable issues. Together, they created exactly the pattern Carl had been experiencing. Carl shook his head. No, that's impossible. Marcus calmly pulled up timestamp comparisons. Router disruptions. Microwave usage. Router disruptions. Microwave usage. Again and again. The patterns lined up so closely that even I couldn't believe it. Every outage Carl had blamed on me had originated from equipment inside his own house. The room became very quiet. I remember looking at Carl and seeing something I hadn't expected. It wasn't embarrassment yet. It was resistance. The desperate resistance people feel when reality refuses to support a story they've invested themselves in. Because at that moment, the internet wasn't the real issue anymore. The real issue was that Carl had spent weeks convincing himself that he was being wronged, and now the evidence was tearing that belief apart piece by piece. Because at that moment, the internet wasn't the real issue anymore. The real issue was that Carl had spent weeks convincing himself that he was being wronged, and now the evidence was tearing that belief apart piece by piece. For several long seconds, nobody said anything. Carl just stood there staring at the screen while Marcus scrolled through timestamp after timestamp, each one telling the same story. I almost felt uncomfortable watching it happen, not because I thought Carl deserved sympathy, but because there is something strangely painful about seeing a person realize they've been fighting the wrong battle all along. The problem was that Carl wasn't just mistaken. He had built an entire narrative around that mistake. He had convinced himself I was the reason his business calls dropped. He had convinced himself I owed him money. He had convinced himself enough to file a formal complaint and drag an internet provider into a neighborhood argument. And now every piece of evidence pointed directly back at his own living room. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. The recommendation is pretty straightforward. Replace the damaged cable, relocate the router, and move it away from the microwave and large metal objects. Carl swallowed hard. That's it. That's it. Then Marcus added something that changed the entire atmosphere in the room. There is one more thing. Carl looked up. What? Marcus closed his laptop. Since this wasn't a service fault or external interference issue, the diagnostic visit will be billed to the reporting customer. I watched Carl's expression freeze. Marcus wasn't finished. And because a formal interference complaint was filed, the report will note that no external interference was found. Future complaints of the same type could result in additional review or penalties if they're determined to be unfounded. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before it. Nobody argued. Nobody raised their voice. There was simply nothing left to argue about. The facts had already spoken. Marcus packed up his equipment, shook both our hands, and headed back toward his van. I thanked him for his time. Carl didn't say a word. He just stood there looking at the floor. As I walked back across the street, I expected him to call after me, to apologize, to explain, to say something. Instead, his front door closed behind him, and that was the last conversation we had for quite a while. About a week later, I happened to be working near my front window when I saw the mail truck stop at Carl's house. A few minutes later, he walked outside, carrying a small envelope. I didn't know for certain what was inside, but I had a pretty good guess. He opened it at the end of the driveway. Even from across the street, I could see the change in his posture. His shoulders tightened, his jaw locked. He stared at the page for several seconds before slowly folding it and walking back inside. The next day, something surprising happened. Nothing. No complaints. No accusations. No suspicious looks from across the street. No dramatic confrontations. The neighborhood simply returned to normal. Months passed, then a year. Eventually, Carl moved away. We never discussed the incident again. And honestly, that's probably for the best. The older I get, the less interested I am in winning arguments. What stays with me isn't the satisfaction of being proven right. It's the lesson underneath it. Sometimes people become so focused on finding someone to blame that they stop looking for the truth. It's easier to point across the street than it is to look inside your own house. Easier to build a villain than admit you might have missed something obvious. Carl wasn't a bad person. At least I don't think he was. He was frustrated. He was convinced he had already found the answer. And once people reach that point, evidence often becomes the enemy. The funny thing is, if he had knocked on my door that first night and simply asked for help, I probably would have walked over with a flashlight and figured out the problem for free. Instead, he spent weeks chasing the wrong suspect and ended up paying for an investigation that proved exactly that. So now I'm curious what you think. Was Carl simply stubborn, or was filing an official complaint without real evidence crossing a line? Have you ever had a neighbor, coworker, friend, or family member become so convinced of something that they ignored every fact pointing in the opposite direction? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this always seem to divide people. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who always blames the Wi-Fi before checking their own router.